they're now obsolete, but in the olden days, what a telephone switchboard would do is take in incoming calls, sort of whip them around, and then connect you with some other place that you were trying to reach. And that's sort of the way I saw myself. You know, I'm not much of a self-starter, in other words, sitting in a room thinking great thoughts. But if I can see things that are happening, if I can feel what's going on, then I can do something with them, and I make them go some other place, create something, do something with it. And so I need those inputs. I've got the processor, and then something magic happens coming out. And so that's what I thought was my basic purpose or skill, whatever. Well, now it's like, it's amazing because there's so many inputs through my work life. I get to hear about what's going on in every part of the world with every asset class, with different kinds of companies, real estate. I can get a unique overview every week of what's happening, and that's also got a political overlay to it. And so then, of course, we're now in an internet world where there's all these other inputs. And television is no longer, 3 network channels that became 4. Now there are hundreds of inputs and more publications. We set up a system that's terrific here, where every Monday, each one of our big areas, private equity, where we probably employ about 500,000 people, one of the biggest in the United States. Real estate, where we're the largest owner of real estate in the world, and sort of our capital extension in the debt business. Each one of these areas, reports and tells you everything that's going on. I don't have to pick. It picks itself. And the people in that group describe what's going on in the world. I've only been doing this for over 30 years. And so you get these feeds from it's raw data. And this is before there was a fixation on data. We get it all the time. And what works for me is the way my mind, I realize now works, is I look for changes, not what's going on. And anybody can see what's going on. That what I'm most interested in are those little imperfections. I call it a piece of white lint on a black dress. Usually people just brush it off. I keep looking at it. What's it doing there? Why has that happened? What does that mean? Because what I'm looking for, I guess you call it some kind of an odd pattern recognition, is something that's changed from the normal order. We were looking at buying some real estate. This is a business example, but there are examples from other areas. We were looking at buying some condominiums in southern Spain in 2006, 2007 era, and we did some analysis and then had a meeting, and the team reported that they were building so many units in Spain that you could move most of Germany into Spain and there'd still be extra units. And then somebody commented from our Indian office, which I didn't even realize we had, that the same thing was happening in India, and that raw land was gone up 10 times in 18 months, which seemed like an impossible thing. And then that weekend, I was in Florida and my house there, and reading the newspaper, and it said that real estate prices for houses were up 25% in 1 year, with like a 1% growth in population. So you could see like a global residential housing boom so strong that it was meant to collapse, which of course it did. And so we adjusted everything we were doing at the firm to not get caught in that mess. And I can go over in more depth exactly what we did. It's not actually not that important, except, we changed, our entire array of where we'd invest, where we wouldn't invest. And so when the subprime crisis happened, where the global financial crisis was triggered, we were positioned in a much different way than almost everybody. And you could see it just with like one or two pieces of information. And so that's the way my mind sort of works. I just see connections of things that I think are sensible. And one of the differences when I see something like that and I figure it out, I'll do it. Part of what I've discovered in life is most people don't like changing what they do. They're quite happy the way they are. And even if they grumble, that isn't enough to make them change course. And so when I see things that are different than other people see them, they're always based, they're fact-based, they're not my opinions. And I can explain, what will happen and why. And hardly anybody cares. In fact, they say typically, that's interesting, and then they go back to what they're doing. I don't understand why it doesn't change their behavior, but it certainly changes mine. And because I'm now in a position, at my own business, Blackstone, and in other things that I do, where when I see something that I think is worthy of a real course correction, which involves starting new things, doing new things, I go and do it. I don't hesitate because they're all logical and I can explain why they would work. I don't find anyone who says, I don't think it'll work. They just don't want to do it. And the way I think is whenever I see one of those opportunities, that's the least risky thing in the world. First, you have no competition. That's one of the things that makes it very easy to go there, and why you're going. It's no different than playing basketball and everybody's guarding everybody, and all of a sudden somebody guarding you falls down and you're 10 feet away from the basket. It's a completely open shot. You take it. You don't think about it. We bought a company in 2007 with a funny name. It was just acronyms. EOP was the largest office company, office buildings in the world. Nothing close. It was worth about $40 billion. And it was near the top of a real estate cycle. We thought it would be interesting to buy for a number of reasons. But the price of the deal started getting higher. It became competitive. And so we did some interesting tactical things to make sure we won. But I was so scared that we were winning, because we could have taken $500 million, I believe, to just go away, let somebody else win. That it just made me, I couldn't sleep at night because it was right on the margin. So we decided to sell half of what we bought, because if you have a huge group of buildings, you can sell them as one or two buildings, you can sell them by city, you can sell them by area. And so what we did is we bought at one price, which was around 5.7% yield, and we sold them, we thought we could sell them at 4.5%. And roughly what that does is it increases the yield
on the stuff you have left so it's safer. So we decided to do that, and I said, I don't want to take 1 minute of risk. This deal is so risky. So I want to simultaneously sell half the day we buy. And the seller of the whole company didn't want to do that. And I said, we said we'd walk. We wouldn't increase our bid to be the buyer. And they said, okay. So imagine buying $40 billion of real estate one day and selling 20 of it the same day. The most amount of real estate that was ever sold in history in a year was 10 billion. So we were doing 6 times what anybody did on one day. And I did that because I was scared, because I hate risk. I don't want to lose $1. And part of what makes people is their background. And I came from a background where, to get spending money or do anything, I had to, have jobs. I cut lawns, I shoveled snow, and then I recruited my brothers to do it. And, I kept half of the profits. That lasted a few years before they realized they could do it all. And I always did things. I sold light bulbs door to door. I sold stationery door to door in college so I could get a KLA stereo. I did all kinds of things. And when you do stuff like that, you really never want to lose your money, because then you just have to keep doing more. And that's a huge effort to knock on somebody's door you don't know what's going to happen. You only do it because you really want to be successful. So I'm not a believer in going backwards. It's not something I endorse. I only like to go forwards. And so I worry about, sort of making a mistake, any type of mistake. And part of the culture at our firm, it's a little different than most, is the first rule is don't lose money. I know this sounds primitive. You don't have to go to Harvard Business School for this. But if you have a philosophy of trying never to lose rather than how much you make, you always end up making a bunch on interesting things. But if you don't have a downside and you only have an upside, and you're in a growing economy, which is where we operate, and you do it on leverage, you'll make very, very high returns, and we have. And so it's a pretty simple model. We had one where we lost $1 billion. We bought a significant percentage of a telephone company in a European country, and we were partners with the government, who had the largest share. We had the second. We had a whole transformation project to have that company do much better. It used to be owned by the government, and we agreed on it completely, and we would have made a very good return. And then there was an election, and the government basically said, I'm sorry, I know I told you I wanted to do all these things with you, but I'm not doing it. And, this is a big country with famous people. And you go over and you sat down with them, and you said, but you told me. And they said, well, things changed. So we lost almost all of our money on that. Learned a lot. One, when a government tells you something, it doesn't mean they're going to do it. At that moment that they tell you they want to do it, but future circumstances can sometimes lead them to change their mind. Sometimes in places in the world, changes of government lead to a new person showing up and say, I don't know why anybody ever agreed with you with that. I'm just canceling that. And so the lack of predictability in dealing with governments is surprisingly high. Secondly, having partners on things can also be a danger because sometimes they can block something that you think is good to do that they've already agreed on, but if they have a change and you don't have enough influence, you can end up in a very bad place. So every time you lose, you learn. And it's unfortunate that those are the best lessons. They're usually expensive. Yeah, in fact, it's more because it's optionality and it's fun. It's not about financial return. It's about the ability to create and do and help people and connect the dots in whether it's in the business world, whether it's in the philanthropic world, whether it's in the political world. You just have enormous access and sort of the ability to address issues in a really positive way. So, geez, my life's never been more exciting. It's wonderful.
I was the oldest child, and the expectation was to get everything right. And it was an interesting expectation because it wasn't drummed into you. It was simply assumed. And there wasn't much reinforcement for doing things, in a 100% manner. But you were just assumed to do it. That was the standard. And no one discussed it. Nobody bought into it. It was just part of what was expected. I guess there's a classic, Jewish mother syndrome, and I certainly had at a minimum an acceptable level of pushing, which was, I think, culturally normal, at least where I came from. And I think my dad wasn't so much that way, but he was and is a very, very smart fellow, smarter than I am still. And with that as a role model, it was somewhat hard to sort of outthink him because he'd usually have the right answer and still does catch little imperfections in logic. So that was what the family scenario was. It was very much from a place where major metropolitan city, this happened to be Philadelphia, where it was in the city, a place where people typically in the late 50s, early 60s would move out and go to the suburbs. It was, could you blast your way out of the city and get to the suburbs? And has nothing to do with the child. That's what the parents do. And my parents made that transition, which was a lucky thing for me. Yes, it would provided a unique model of something I did not want to do. And he worked with his father in a retail business that sold curtains, linens, draperies, handkerchiefs. And I started working there, in effect, at the age of 5, which he did with his father. And I found it an absolutely horrible way to spend time. I didn't like waiting on customers. I didn't like folding merchandise. I didn't like dust in basements where you had to mark merchandise. And I decided that whatever I did in life, that would not be part of it. Well, he's got a very amiable, wonderful disposition, and he heard that, and then I would end back at the store the next year. So I think during the time when I was a child, you more or less do what you're told, subject to 1 or 2 years of revolution where I decided I had had it. But I don't think that not going into that environment was heartbreaking for my dad. Was what he did.
Well, I was good at a lot of athletic things. I was good at hitting a softball, for long distance. I was good at running faster than anybody else I was with. And, I love the feeling of of doing those things well. There were always smarter kids in my class. In high school, we had about 900 people in my class, and it's a good-sized high school. The best I ever did was number 32, and that meant there were 31 people who were actually much smarter than I was. I was trying my maximum. I couldn't do any better. And some people who seemed to be pretty effortless were better than me. So, I was good at leading people and mobilizing people. And so I did that. And I was president of my school and was a really good athlete. And we were in a state championship team. And so I did the best I could with academics. But academics are interesting. Minds, as you learn when you're older, work differently. And the people who do really well in school, are on a track that somebody designed for a definition of what's good at school. Not everybody's mind works like that. For me, it was always, somewhat difficult. I always wished I was more capable in that area. I was good enough, to get into good schools, but it was always like barely.
I had some amazing teachers and coaches. I had a history teacher in the 11th grade in American history named Norman Schmidt, who was wonderful. He just made American history burst forth, and I was entranced by it. I always liked to study and get good grades, but there were always kids smarter. There were always that, I might be in the top, I don't know, 6% of my class, but that meant there were 5% that were smarter. And indeed they were. I also had an amazing track coach, ironically named Jack Armstrong, very much like an all-American boy, and indeed he was. When we ran competitively, we were second in the country in the AAU Junior Championships, and his teams, as a testament to him, rather than any of the individuals like myself, when I graduated from high school, until that time, he had been 107-2 as a record in dual meets, which meant that he went through many different generations of kids, and the kids always mysteriously ended up being enormously capable, which was a testament to him. And he would have all kinds of wonderful ways of motivating people, and we used to train in the winter as well as the summer. We trained outdoors in the freezing cold, ran sprints and middle distances on frozen parking lots, which is a real challenge as the wind's whipping and you're wondering if your legs are going to go out from under you. And no matter how miserable you felt, he would be there smiling, and as you rounded the location where he was, he'd say, you got to make some deposits on training day to make some withdrawals on meet day. And he was very cheerful, because after a while you were wondering, why were you going through this level of agony?
So I realized what I was doing was making these horrible deposits of sort of bashing myself physically. So when it was time to actually compete, it was effortless. And so I've learned many lessons from great inspirational people, but that seemed totally practical to me, unfortunately, and I hated every minute of it. But I liked the winning, when we had meets, and that was just an example.
But the camaraderie on the team was fantastic. I was the only Caucasian in most of the races that I was ever in, and because I ran sprints, so that made it, sort of a whole cultural experience for me, which I really enjoyed. I was also one of these student leader people. I was usually the president of my school, or president of my junior high school, president of my high school, and so I was one of those, what do you call them, student leader type people. I went to Yale because when I was interviewing at schools, I saw a kid walking down a street. I can still see him right now, wearing, sort of tan chinos, bass weegens, which are kind of shoe for us mid-lifesters when we were young, and a blue long sleeve shirt with a button-down collar and a corduroy sport coat. And I looked at that kid and I said, I want to be that kid. And I was a major in an interdisciplinary major, which was a new thing then, which was psychology, sociology, anthropology, and biology, which is really, sort of the study of the human being. Why do they think what they think? Why do they act the way they act? You studied from all four of those disciplines. I remember interviewing with a company. They had it was fun for me to remember some of these things. It was a company called Pan American Airlines, which at that point was the dominant, international character, subsequently bankrupt. It was started by Yale graduate Juan Tripp, and so they interviewed at school, and I went to interview with them, and I sat down, and there was a very establishment-looking fellow, and he said, well, why do you want to work at Pan American? And I said, well, I've sort of got an idea. He said, I said, it's the Vietnam War looks like it's coming to a close, and there's probably a lot of surplus airplanes around, and why don't you just buy up a lot of those airplanes and go into the cargo business? And the guy looked at me like I was completely deranged, which he may have been true. And he said, it's not your job to think about things like that. And I listened to that and I said, I don't know anything about business, but I think this company is going to do very badly if that's the response of their representative to what I thought was a pretty clever idea. And there were companies started around that time, apparently, to do that, like Flying Tiger and other types of things. Given the Pan Am name, which was sort of the best branded name in the airline business, I thought, I was 21, what did I know? I thought that was a good thing, but it didn't sell, and I didn't go to Pan Am, and I had no job when I graduated, and it's a wonderful story of how I ended up sort of where I was, where I went to, and I was working at a reunion because I didn't have much money, and I also had no plans, and I was a senior, and I don't know why I did this, but there was a family at these reunions. This was the 15th reunion, so that meant that the people were 37 years old. And there was a family having a picnic in the quadrangle, and I thought they looked really romantic and like a nice family, and I went out, and for no reason, because I didn't even have any money really, I bought Bob Barr the Elephant book, which is a book that my parents used to read to me, and I just went over and I gave the book to this kid. The father looked up and said, what are you doing? I said, well, I don't know what I'm doing, but I used to read this as a kid. You look like you have two wonderful children. The fellow was a gentleman named Bill Donaldson, and Bill started a firm that was very small then, called Donaldson, Lufkin, and Jennerat. And I didn't do anything directly with him at that point, but he had a friend that was sitting with him named Larry Noble, and Larry worked at the admissions office, and Larry sort of befriended me, and as I was looking for a job, he would introduce me to people in New York, and at that point, this was a very formal world of finance, and I had no economics courses. And in fact, I didn't even own a suit. So I bought my first suit, and Larry would send me on interviews. I met the number 2 person at one of the New York banks, and I had only been in a bank to make a deposit in a passbook. And here I was meeting the number 2 person at some giant money center bank, and I could remember being almost completely overwhelmed that I went to this man's office and he offered me lunch, and it was right in the next room. The idea that, one, you could sort of offer somebody lunch in an office building, and the second, that he would do that with me was pretty overwhelming. The offices were so big, I thought I was on one of those walking belts at an airport going the wrong way. I could never get to his office, it was so far. But he offered me a job. He's a very nice man, and he offered me a job and recommended I not take it. And I said, why is that? He said, I think that you're too smart and too quick for my type of organization. And what you should do is go to an organization that's very small, comprised of very bright people doing anything. He said, it doesn't matter what they do. It just matters that it's small and the people are very smart. I said, otherwise you're going to be unhappy. So I went back to this fellow, Larry Noble, and said that was the advice. He said, oh, you should go see Bill Donaldson. He has a small, investment banking firm. And I went down to see him, and the appointment, he was late. He was doing something else. And I was sitting in a lobby, and at that point they had nothing but young guys working there and beautiful girls. And I was watching all this, taking it in and looking at this skyline out of a new building, 140 Broadway in 1969. And then I went to see Bill for my interview, and he said, why do you want to work here? And I said, frankly, I don't even know what you do here. But I know that everybody I've seen is very excited about it. And with all these bright guys and pretty women, whatever they're doing, I want to do it. And he gave me a big smile. I was there for 6 months, and then I went into the Army Reserves and then back to Harvard Business School. People have observed that you only learn truly by failing. And I thought, a complete failure at this job. I had no economics. I had no ability to read a financial statement. I had never had accounting, and they gave me an office and a secretary and some annual reports and assignments, and I didn't even know how to approach it. And I'm pretty good on my feet. I'm pretty decent at bobbing and weaving, but there's only so long you can bob and weave when you don't have a good base. And so it became clear to me, without anybody advising me, that leaving myself in an environment where I was intellectually unprepared was a danger, not only to me, but to everybody that I had anything to do with. So I went to business school really just to deal with this complete lack of preparation that I had, and I really didn't like the kind of research-oriented business that DLJ was doing. I found I wasn't, particularly good at that either, instinctively, and so I interviewed at a variety of businesses out of business school, investment banks and advertising businesses, and I think a consulting business. I remember going to a advertising firm. They offered me a job, and the compensation was $10,000, and so I looked at the fellow who was offered me the job, who thought it was a wonderful thing, and I started laughing, and he looked at me and he said, "Too high or too low?" And I said, "The fact that you wouldn't know is the problem." The starting salaries at that point in the investment banking business were $17,000. He was at 10. Now, it's when you're off by that percentage, that's pretty bad. And the fact that he was so unaware of what sort of was being paid competitively, I said, well, this is an industry where you can't make a lot of money if they don't really know even where they are. And I interviewed at the different investment banking firms and in the corporate finance business, which I sort of felt like the right thing. And it felt like the right thing because you were helping people. In other words, executives would tell you their problems and you would come up with a solution, and you were both on the same team, and they were helping, you were helping, and that seemed like something that wasn't too complex. You didn't have to be overburdened with intellect. We're not talking about brain surgery here. This is finance: add, subtract, multiply, and divide. It wasn't until decades later that calculus really came into finance on the trading side. So it seemed a comfortable fit. When I was at Yale, I figured out what I wanted to do, but I didn't know it existed. I figured that I wanted to be a telephone switchboard. Now, we don't have telephone switchboards just about anymore, but I wanted to have coming in enormous amounts of data. I wanted it to go into a central processor, and I wanted some kind of output. But I really wanted the volumes of input. And I didn't know where in the world I could find a job like that. And I didn't know it was investment banking. I didn't have any real understanding of investment banking. So I just started looking around, and I guess Pan Am wasn't it, and advertising wasn't it, and consulting was okay, but nobody really listened to you. They do, but usually you're hired for political purposes as often as real purposes, to have one executive's view, be the controlling one, or to convince a board to do something that maybe they don't want to do. But I was very lucky. As soon as I sort of found this corporate finance field, I said, that's it. I recognized that was the fit of the model that I already had in my head, because I figured that model was going to be, that was a fun model, because you keep getting all this stimuli and stimulus and always changing, and then you need to do something with it. And then you actually make something happen, not just talk about it. I think investment banking is pretty easy, and the reason why I was probably pretty good at it is that it's very easy to get the sort of fundamental base for it, and then after that, it's anticipating what's going to happen, figuring out new things, new relationships, solving problems that look like they're that people haven't focused on sort of in the right way. And I don't know if that describes it, but there were, just one thing I can remember just sort of at random, which I was proud of at the time, seemed pretty simple to me. And there was one of these development institutions like the World Bank. It had a different name. And they had a variety of bonds outstanding, and each of those bonds had what's called covenants, which are really restrictions in them. And the bank wanted to do something, but wasn't able to because some of these issues, forbid them. And they still wanted to do something, but they couldn't get those bonds in. They couldn't call them. They were stuck with it, and it was an important initiative, and everybody was real concerned. They didn't know what to do, and so nobody could solve the problem. And I was one of the people working on this, and I remember going home at night, and I often think of things when I'm sleeping. I don't sleep real deep REM stuff, and I woke up and I said, what's the problem here? The problem is that these bondholders, want to be protected for something. And what's the worst that can happen to them? The worst that can happen is if you did the bad thing and it didn't work out, they'd lose their money, right? So I said, why don't we just take a bunch of money, because banks always have money, and just dedicate that money behind those bonds and go ahead and do whatever we want to do. Because the worst that can happen is that they'd lose their money. And if we assure them that they could never lose their money, then they don't have to worry. Right. And if they don't have to worry, they have no cause for damages against the institution for going ahead and doing something. Mm-hmm. So I came in with some elaborate, sort of proposal to do that for large amounts of money. At that point, large amounts were hundreds of millions. Now it would be tens of billions. And everybody just sort of sat there and went, geez, no one's ever done this. And I said, well, so what? Aren't we addressing the problem? They all said, yeah, but it's not legal. I said, forget the legal part for the moment. I mean, it's not technically legal, but if we went to all the bondholders and asked them for a vote and said, there's no conceivable way you could lose money because the money to pay off the bonds and their interest is already dedicated, and we got a pretty high percentage of the vote, I said, that seems to me like a risk you can take because you're doing nothing unethical. You're protecting the bondholders better than they are today. Okay? Today they just have to rely on the general credit of the institution, and we're making it even better. We're putting a few $100 million worth of cash behind to guarantee the payment. I said, who could be unhappy? And so they did that. They bought in because they had a problem, okay? And they wanted that problem solved. So I've always found in investment banking that there's real logic to everything, and I don't understand why somebody else didn't come up with that. They probably would have at some point, but I've always found, and I really didn't specialize in doing financings like that. I really did merger things with most of my career, and that's just another derivation of solving problems. And in the merger business, there's also the ability to just sort of go out on a limb and sort of invent things. Sort of creatively imagine what would this company buy before they might even think about it, and then sort of go to them and convince them, and then convince the other side to do something, or negotiation, which is a lot of people don't like really being in zero-sum games, and you try and make a zero-sum game not a zero-sum game. But that's your first level of solving problems. But at the end of the day, if money's being paid, usually it's out of somebody's pocket into somebody else's pocket, and so that is a zero-sum game at the end of the day, and usually that generates huge amounts of conflict and tension. A lot of people don't like being in situations like that, and for whatever the series of reasons, that didn't bother me, and don't always enjoy it, but didn't bother me. It would be normal for the other person to get angry if you were demanding a lot of money or something. Right. That would be a normal response, so because it was normal, it would never upset me. And if I were on the other side, it would just be the opposite. But I found that I was pretty well adapted for this stuff, in large part because finance has much to do with understanding what's on the other person's mind. And if you can understand what's on their mind, and in effect, that's the problem to solve. And there's a zone of fairness where you can solve that for that person at the same time, not disadvantage the other person you're representing. And so that was probably what made me pretty good, because you could sit down and you don't even have to meet with the other people to know what's on their mind, because you say, well, if I were them, yes, what would I want? In 1984, Lehman Brothers, where I had worked for my career, had been sold to American Express. I actually was the person handling that transaction. I was 36 years old or 35, I forget which, and I had a non-competition agreement, and as part of my wanting to do that deal, I wanted to leave for a variety of reasons that I didn't like what ethically had happened with the firm. I didn't want to be with the people, not all the people, but the leadership people. And so I worked out a situation where I joined the former chairman of the firm, Lehman, who had been pushed out, which necessitated the need for the sale. And he and I had always worked very closely together. So all we were trying to do by forming Blackstone was sort of reforming our own working relationship. And we didn't view it, and on this, I'm sure I was, sort of colossally naive as that big a step. I knew we had always been successful doing almost everything together commercially, and I didn't understand why we wouldn't be. The fact that we had no phone, no office, no company, that small little companies like this were not successful in investment banking. In fact, they didn't exist at all. There was only one of them that existed, which was a small firm founded by a fellow named Jim Wolfenson, and Jim's currently the head of the World Bank. And but even Jim had never done any large mergers until that time, and we just assumed that we would be accepted as the sort of equivalent of a Salomon Brothers or a Lehman Brothers or Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley. And I guess that's the height of ridiculous hubris. Because we were too silly to understand that people might be worried about that, we went ahead. It worked out, I must say, for those who haven't had the experience of doing startup businesses. At least in the mid-'80s, it wasn't quite as amusing as apparently it is in 1998 or 97 in the internet, where there was tons of money available now. That was not the case then. And in New York, which may be atypical in the United States, people are only happy if someone they know well is failing. Particularly when you're more vulnerable in a smaller setting like we were at Blackstone. I know there were many sort of former colleagues who were staying at big firms who were looking at what we were doing, and some were hoping that we'd make it, but we were somewhat of a threat if we could make it just in a small organization. And end up making a good deal more financially than the people who stayed at the large one. That was in effect a threat to a system. So we were not aware of this, of course. All we were trying to do was pay the rent. We had more modest expectations, at the beginning. But we took a number of large leaps at the firm, and part of that is, you asked a question earlier, what makes someone successful? And I think that another answer is sort of feeling what's going on around you, seeing what's going on around you, and taking a big step to take advantage of that. And one of those steps for us is the second year we were formed, we decided to go forward with a plan we had when we started to go into the leveraged buyout business. Neither my partner or I had ever done a leveraged buyout, which one might think would be a liability when raising money. My partner, who's very experienced, capable fellow, previously Secretary of Commerce and Chairman of Lehman Brothers, wanted us to raise $50 million to do our fund and start doing smaller deals and learn and then raise something larger. I had been over and visiting one of the large firms, and I looked at their balance sheet, and it actually was a company called First Boston, and at that point in history they had $1 billion of equity. And I said, you know what, I think it would be fun to have $1 billion of equity without all the people. And I said, I think we could do that. So I went back and met with my partner, and I said, we're gonna raise $1 billion. And at that time, there were only 2 other organizations on the planet that had $1 billion. And he said, how can we do that? We don't have any experience. And I said, I know we can. I said, the time is right. We're in the 80s. It's sort of 1986. There's enormous momentum. leverage buyouts are becoming very popular. They're going on the covers of news magazines, on the front pages of newspapers. There aren't enough vehicles to take advantage of this. We're well-known people. And he said, quite intelligently, that's a long way from $1 billion. And I said, I just know we can do this. And in fact, if we tell people that we want $1 billion, then if they were going to just give us $10 million for a small thing, they'll give us $50 million.
Right.
Okay? Because we'll have scaled up expectations. And he said, I'm going to be a good partner, but I think we're biting off more than we can chew. And he was probably right. We ended up raising $850 million, going through enormous amounts of difficulty. We subsequently raised another $100 million from one of those investors. So we got to 960 actually at the end, and it launched the firm in a scale where we always did very big things, because that's what I wanted to do. It's also what my partner wanted to do. He just didn't know that that was achievable, and none of us knew, but he was a good enough partner and a smart enough man to also back my vision of what I thought was achievable. Now, that's just an instinct, and one has those types of instincts in my type of business, and I don't know how one describes how you would know that could happen. But it's from reading the newspaper, seeing what's going on, and feeling what people are talking about, and just knowing that ought to be possible. There's certain ways that people think, patterns of thought. But I've in our firm, we've gone into a lot of new businesses, and we're subsequently, quite big. We're one of the biggest investors in what are now called alternative assets, which is leverage buyouts, real estate, hedge funds, mezzanine debt in the world. And every time we have one of these new perceptions that there's a really interesting thing to be done, you just do it. It's sort of like a basketball player who only shoots when they get a real good sense that they're in the zone. Okay, it's not like a player who keeps forcing because they're throwing them the ball, that they got to put it up. They have a cold hand and they're throwing up bricks and they have to keep doing it. This is a game that you play only when you have a really strong feeling. It's like fishing in a pond that's been deeply stocked with giant trout. Now, that pond is stocked, but other people don't necessarily agree with you. And there's a certainty that comes when you just know that things are lining up. We went into, you don't have to be very smart about this either. I mean, we went into the real estate business in 1991. I never bought any real estate. I didn't even understand it. I always felt uncomfortable with real estate because buildings don't move and neighborhoods change. So can't you make a bad decision? Companies can at least change their products. Buildings don't move. There they are. And we were in the recession, and real estate was collapsing. Everybody wanted to sell real estate, and somebody brought us a deal which had a 15% yield on it. There's a bunch of apartment buildings, and ironically, Little Rock, Arkansas, bankruptcy of a savings and loan. I don't know if it was the same one that was involved with the more popular things of the time. And we could borrow money off of that 15% yield and earn about 23-24% at the bottom of a recession, with apartments that were close to new. And I said, well, what can go wrong here? The economy can't go any worse than it is now. If the economy gets stronger, then rents will go up. It's hard to borrow money now and at that time, and even with the difficulty of borrowing money, we were earning 24%, on our equity. So I figured when times got better, money would be more available, interest rates would be down further, you could borrow more on the property, and so there was no downside, there was only upside. The present moment when we were doing it was really already excellent. So why not just buy as much real estate as you could possibly find? And there was a whole country of real estate to be found at that time. Now, to me, this doesn't go into the blinding insight mode. Anybody, when told those same facts, I would assume, would act rationally and would be buying real estate. In point of fact, the problem was everybody who would normally be buying real estate had already lost a fortune. And was in no position because most of them were either bankrupt or undergoing enormous difficulties with their existing properties. They couldn't go ahead. And if they went to a bank to borrow money, they were creating bankruptcies for the same banks, so the banks didn't want to talk to them. And we were sort of there alone with 2 or 3 other groups of people who had never been in real estate and saw the same things.
We usually have in our private equity area like 80 to 120 of them. It depends what we're selling and how rapidly we're selling and how rapidly we're buying. We own, hundreds of billions of dollars of real estate. And then we have other companies we have minorities interests in our tactical opportunities business and also in our credit business. So, I've never totaled that up. I should, because that way I could have a snappy answer. I don't think about it as big because, we operate with small groups of people around the firm. And we have sort of verticals that specialize in doing things, whether it's owning companies or owning real estate or one business that does, sort of both. We have all kinds of activities, and the way I look at them, and the way I look at ourselves is that we're just a small partnership. And every meeting you go to, you basically have a relatively reasonable number of people there that you can talk to. And if you could talk to everybody, then there's a sense of intimacy. And what we do is we use our screens around the world, our video screens, to invite the people in those locations into that intimate conversation. And so I don't accept the concept of bigness. I don't like the concept of bigness. I like intimacy, and I think everybody at the firm should feel that way. And so we run it in a way where people know other people and where it's personal and it touches you. And the idea of being part of a big thing, where big typically means impersonal, that's like a bad outcome. There's a little amusement, a venue in London that was called the London Dungeon. And, people take their kids there. It's by the Tower of London, and you go under, sort of an overpass, and, they sort of built caves, and, people would, be middle-aged kind of guys in armor, and they'd come out with hatchets and almost hit you in the head. And one of my partners, in this case Joe Barata, wanted to buy this little company. It only cost $80 million. Now, for regular people, $80 million is a lot of dollars, but in our world, $80 million is very, very small for an acquisition. And you couldn't make the London Dungeon bigger. It was like occupied all the space it could. And so I said, Joe, why would we ever do this? I mean, this is like ridiculous. We're going to own the London Dungeon. And he said, but the manager is so terrific that he's going to find other things to do. This guy is marvelous. And so I tried to make it go away. But Joe kept coming back. And so at the end, I sort of said to myself, look, okay, it's $80 million. Maybe we're overpaying, maybe we're not. The worst that's going to happen is that the dungeon's going to stay full. And whatever, cash flow we make from the dungeon will continue. And if it doesn't work, we can sell the dungeon to somebody else. And so I said, okay, go ahead. By the time Joe and the manager of that business bought things, I bought Legoland, which was making no money, and now it makes a fortune. They bought Gardaland, which is the largest amusement park in Italy. Madame Tussauds. It was like endless. We ended up as the second biggest theme park company in the world. And it didn't have anything to do with me. It had to do, with one of our gifted people, Joe Barata, who believed in somebody. And I just got beaten down enough, I did it. Actually, it gets easier and easier as you get older, just because you learn, what's necessary. And, you always have to prepare. In other words, you have to read things, to know what's going to happen in certain situations. And you have to, I usually think while I'm sleeping. It's a little odd, but that's how my mind processes things. So you have to just make sure you have information that you can process, and then you have to assemble great teams of people on almost any interesting problem. Do we make an investment? Do we do this? How do we handle? In some other part of my life, whether it's the not-for-profit area, if we have some issue going on somewhere in the world, I'll know I have to make some decision the next day on that. And when I go to sleep, I'm thinking about that subliminally before I go to sleep. I just continue, and so for the whole night, you're banging around something, alternatives, what would happen if you went one way versus another way, what feels right. And then when you wake up, you have a sense of where you want to go. And sometimes you need another factor to which happens the next day. And if a factor two happens one way, it'll drive you to alternative A, and if it happens the other, it's alternative B. But you already know, what you'll do in possession of those additional pieces of information. They normally come when I'm sleeping or when I've been focused on an issue, and some fact comes in that completes a pattern. And that's determinative, and then you go. It's unpredictable. It's not keyed to days, it's keyed to information. Or reading a person, which is also information. Or listening to something and the way it's described, which is also information. Doesn't have to be hard information. Got a violin that lasted for a few months, and I have no skills of that type. I just I like lots of different type of music, and I always have. I'm from Philadelphia, so Philadelphia was the home of a TV show that I think doesn't exist anymore, called American Bandstand. So when rock and roll started in 1955, I can remember Elvis Presley's first song. Uh, and, uh, and so I was lucky in terms of when I was born that, sort of, in effect, modern rock and roll started, um, when I was like the right age, and I caught the whole thing. Politically, some people, for some reason, worry about private capital in situations that need it, and I find that like hard to imagine. For example, if there's in other countries, like Australia, for example, what they do is they take assets that already are yielding a cash flow, like an airport or a bridge with tolls or something of that type. And what they do there, and other countries do this as well, is they encourage the municipality that owns it to sell it to the private sector. And the federal government in those countries gives a bonus to that municipality, usually 15 or 20%, even more money, if they agree to take that money and reinvest in more infrastructure. So you're getting a huge amount of money and you're building new things. In some cases, those things don't yield a cash flow, like just a regular road. It's still got to be fixed up, or a bridge that you don't charge tolls on. It's got to be fixed. Where's the money coming from? So this is a mechanism that's been wildly successful, that's opposed by one of the two political parties in the United States. And you sort of go, well, what's your problem with that? It works all over the world, and they it's some kind of ideological or emotional thing, and they say, well, private capital won't invest. They don't want to keep the thing going. They'll overcharge. There are ways of dealing with that. Obviously, other countries have done it. I think there isn't enough capital that can just come in from governments, unfortunately. The tax base in the United States has changed a lot. We used to have a very vibrant middle class in the United States. And now about half of the people in the United States live paycheck to paycheck. People who are in that position don't have a lot of spare money to be paying taxes the way it was 40 years ago after World War II. We're in a knowledge economy now, and it's going to only accelerate in the future. And our schools as a group are not preparing students for that. We've fallen from when I went to school quite some time ago, where American schools were, at the top of the world, somewhere into the mid-20s compared to other countries, and that's just not a statistic. In science, we're even lower than that, and so we're living off of people of my generation, off of immigrants that came from other countries to keep us relevant. The great thing is it only takes 12 years. So this isn't like a problem that can't be addressed. You have to have, computer science, in a curriculum for everybody. You have to teach coding to everybody. You have to have matches between employers like they do in Germany and people in schools. There's a whole series of easy things to do, which for some reason our system more or less insists on not doing. And we're going to have to learn these lessons from other countries and employ them. And once we make that decision, we'll be able to very quickly become much more competitive. People's incomes will go up, and the disruption that's going to happen in the future from artificial intelligence and other advancements, and just the obsolescence of industries and job classifications, if we don't create sort of self-reliant, mobile, educated people. The Germans have figured out how to do that. They don't have job training centers. They give the money to the companies in each location, and those companies relate to schools. And sometimes, I was just talking with somebody yesterday in an American model where they had 3 industries where they teach kids in high school what they do. They give them an apprenticeship, and then they hire them after high school, and in good jobs. And there are all kinds of models that work, virtually none of which we do as a country. There are a few exceptions, but we haven't had the call to action in this area with the effectiveness that we should. I'll tell you one thing, all parents know about it. They want their children to have a great outcome, and that should be a real entitlement in America. I just gave a bunch of money to my high school. And apparently it's the largest amount of money ever given to an American high school. And I did that because they had, sort of expansion issues and modernizations issues. But what I was interested in is making sure that people in the United States, who are in that top 50%, could be approached by educators of public schools, so that they no longer just thought they were educators. They need the resources. You can't get it from the tax base. You have to go to your more successful people in your community or your graduates who moved out of your community to support you. I worry about all kinds of things. Some of the geopolitical issues facing the world. Geopolitical is like a long name, but issues like North Korea and use of nuclear weapons and having nuclear weapons, divisiveness in democracies generally around the world, U.S. particularly. If you had to check, is our country on the right track or wrong track? I think, you'd get some right check things, but you'd get a lot of wrong check. I mean, ideology seems to dominate, sort of logic. And that's something I'm not trained for, but apparently, and on an increasing level, other people are. And that's not the way to make a productive and fruitful society. And, these things break in a lot of different ways. And I would say there's a lot to be concerned about. And I am, and I try and deal with some of these things to make some aspects of them better, if I can. I think divisiveness is either going to get addressed by changing the nominating process for president. I think it's it's only going to get addressed at that level, and I think we're going to evolve at some point into a unifying type of presence, which is really tough to get when the political process and nominating process has so many people involved. Typically, where relatively small amounts of votes can make you the largest vote getter in a big field. I'd have a lot fewer people, because the large number of people means you can have relatively few votes and be double somebody else, everybody else. And so you end up winning, but you have a very small constituency. And somehow we've gotten off on that approach, which, You know, I don't know whether smoke-filled rooms are better or worse, but that kind of arithmetic process where, you know, you can have a mayor elected with 18% of the vote, and you sort of go, what happened here? That's not a good outcome. Yeah, what I'd say is be as good as you can be. In other words, you know, life is competitive. I don't know exactly what people are taught these days, but it is. You know, you want to get the best job. You want to learn the most. And so you have to start that with good personal habits. You want to do well on tests. You want to study. You want to have discipline. You want to get you should get used to winning and achieving something that you're capable of. And so pick things that you're good at. If you're good at athletics, pour your heart into it. If you're good at, you know, sort of science, other things, you know, try and win a science fair. Always try and be at the top of what you do if you have the capability, and find something that you're really excellent at, and have some passion on these things. This isn't mechanical. You have to believe you really want to achieve these things. I think they'll have more options, but they'll be more anxious if they don't have adequate financial resources. And that's why we have to bring this together. That's why we have to do something in the educational world where everybody has a great shot of success. In 2018, what the reason for optimism is this explosion of knowledge and you know, interconnection and science. I mean, people can end up living to 100 as a matter of course, and you know, replacing parts, and the impact of the entire semiconductor world, whether it's computerization, other types of things, and the ability to basically be creative in the world we live in is pretty remarkable, because you can do things remotely. You don't have to be tethered to any one place. And so there are a lot of different ways to make a living.
If you have the right vision and the right perception, the rising tide will indeed lift all boats. Right. If you happen to have a, you know, sort of a super buoyant boat, you'll do better. If you have a super fast boat, you'll go faster. But the tide is going to bring up all the boats. So the thing that's most important is figuring out where those special things are going to be happening. And that's really pretty easy.